All right. And as a notice to all, we are recording this webinar to post it on the, on the web in the future. So anyone who wants to check this out moving forward will be able to do so. So it'll be up. And anything you say can or will be recorded, I guess. All right, it is now 1 o'clock. So let's get started with Plug and Play, FlowJo's new plugin bundle with no R configuration. So I'm very excited that you've chosen to join me today. Thank you for that. I think this is a really nice tool that will make using plugins a lot easier going forward. So just to set the stage here, plugins are add-on algorithms that anybody can develop. And so many of them are developed by any people outside of BD, people who are doing research into bioinformatics software. So we have limited control over them in what language they're written in and so forth. But I think they're really important to be able to support. I don't think any one company can design all of the tools that are needed to analyze today's high dimensional data. There's so many interesting use cases, so many interesting subsets, sub-packages that are going to be useful, that I think it's really important for FlowJo and any other software that you might use to be extensible so that people can add on their own tools as needed for their specific research. So I really think we will always support plugins in some way or another, but we would like to make it easier. And so, but for a lot of folks, the real difficulty with plugins has been, maybe permissions or just some of the setup with getting anything that an outside researcher wrote in R to be able to enable in FlowJo. A lot of that is just because the version of R, the version of the plugin, the version of FlowJo all have to match and so forth. And so let's see if we can help you out with that. And so what the Plug and Play bundle is a set of the 6, I think, most common, most used plugins listed over here. There we go, that require R. And they're bundled together with R and everything needed to set them up, so that the only thing needed for the setup is just to download the bundle and drop it in place. So I hope this is the first of many updates to the bundles as we include more and more plugins just to auto install themselves and set this up and work easily. So let's get into it. This may be the shortest of the advanced webinars we do. The plan here is I will just walk through setting up and running what the Plug and Play bundle. We'll then go through what these plugins are. Sorry, pointing the wrong direction. What these plugins are for anybody who's interested. But if you know what FlowAI and Flowsom are and so forth, you're welcome to say see you later halfway through this thing, because I think the real important part of this is just that these are super easy to get and use. The other important part is, for the moment, these are just for specific operating systems. So just for Windows 10, just for Mac Mojave and Mac Catalina. The plan is to extend them in the future so that they work on the more modern Mac OSs and for Windows 11 and so forth. But since we have them up and running and ready to go for those operating systems, which I think are what most folks are running on right now, it's time to make them available. So I should have said, hi, I'm John Quinn. This is my contact info here, john.flowjo@bd.com. If you have any questions on this at any point, feel free to write me. You can also write just flowjo@bd.com for tech support help. But having introduced and told you what this is about, let's get started. All right, so I am going to share my screen. All right, here we are. First things first, let's go get them. So I'm going to just open up a web browser, go to flowjo.com. Definitely going to sign up for our newsletter. Highly recommend it. All right, and amongst the tabs at the top, there is Downloads and FlowJo Exchange plugins. If I click here, it takes me to the Exchange page. So on the Exchange, every one of these tabs is a different plugin. You can sort by type of plugin, what general category of algorithm that you're going to run, or whether it's for FlowJo or SeatGeek. You can also search. So let us search for Plug and Play Bundle. There you go. Plug and Play Bundle. A recapitulation of the information that I put up on those slides, or the one slide we'll use today, and download. So I'll hit that, and that is going to download whichever one of the operating system zip files I want to do. I'm a Mojave user still. I have to make my FlowJo version 9 work, so I'm still there. All right, so that's going to download, and I will just take this moment to back up a second and just point out that Miguel Velasquez Palafox, did the brunt of the work on this. It was his vision, and I just want to acknowledge the effort he put into this. He'll have a blog post coming up. I highly encourage you to read that. And let's just peek in at the Q&A. I see there is a question. Can the R installed be used otherwise, e.g. for non-bundled plugins? Yes, but you would have to point to it, so there would be a moment of setup, Malcolm. So yeah. All right, and I will leave Q&A up in case anybody else has other questions, and just see if I can kind of minimize it. Cool, answer live. Okay, so we get a zip file, double click on that zip file, and you will get a unzip file, which is going to include a README PDF and the actual bundle itself. So the bundle itself, you will have to put somewhere on your computer that you'll be able to find. And I'm going to put it right into this folder called Pick Me. And I think I just missed. Okay, boom, it's in there. The how-to PDF will cover pretty much everything we're about to say here. It also gives some details on each of the individual algorithms as well. Okay, so that said, I can unload both of those, and I'm going to start FlowJo up. So the way FlowJo knows what plugins to load into its dropdown menu is whatever is in the specified folder at time of start. So at the moment, my workspace has, my full list of plugins pointed at my regular folder. But what we want to do is configure this now to point at my Pick Me folder. So if you'd come through with no plugins, no setup, under Diagnostics, sorry, I went through that quickly, Heart button, Diagnostics, show all diagnostics, boom. Okay, there'll be a spot at the bottom to scan for plugins. So you'll want to check that on and choose wherever it is that, so I just put that on my desktop, Pick Me, wherever that folder is. So I picked Pick Me, cool. So this is where, by the way, Malcolm, that you would tell FlowJo where R is. If you're using the plugin play package, don't need to. Okay, I'm going to quit FlowJo and start it up again. So as it starts, it's looking in the Pick Me folder, and it finds those plugins that I specified, listed all as part of just that one bundle, and they're ready to go. So that is how plug and play works. And I don't really have a whole lot else to say, and I think that's a good thing. Download it, tell us where you put it, it's ready to go. So from here on out, for the remaining 52 minutes or so that we have left of this webinar, I'll show you what the plugins are and how to use them. It looks like we've got another question in the Q&A. Can you put these plugins in the standard folder with the other plugins? Yes, you can, Lauren. Good question. I will suggest even that there are a handful of plugins that are going to be super complementary to the ones that are right here. It's worth downloading them and dropping them into the same folder, and you're good to go. If you've got multiple versions of the same plugin, we will generally just use the first one in the list. And so if you've got a working version of the plugin already in there, you drop plug and play, I think you can use them both. So anyway, you're welcome, Malcolm, who says, that was easy. I'm good, bye, which is really what I hope a lot of people are doing right now, saying that was so easy, because it's the whole point of this webinar. So let us drag a little data for plug and play into our workspace and go through what we've got in there. Okay, so we have included both FlowAI and FlowClean. Those are two tools for doing data QC. My personal preference between them is FlowAI, just because it produces some nice graphics. The first time you run a plugin, you're going to be asked to save your workspace. So let's save this as plugin play demo. And I'll just pop that on the desktop. In part, you're asked to save general good practices, but also so that we know we've got right permission to put any kind of derivatives that the plugin might produce. So the FlowAI test, or FlowClean would do this as well, is going to ask you which parameters you want to inspect for consistency over time. It's going to ask you what types of checks you would like to use. Do you want to look at the flow rate? Do you want to look at the signal acquisition range, the dynamic range? I tend to pick all of them. It's got some tunables for what would you like to filter out or filter in. Let's see. So let's say FR is flow rate. I was just checking another question here. An anonymous attendee says, for the plugins that require R, do you need to know how to use R? So the answer to that is no. We are using an R-based plugin right now. So all the R I needed to know was, if it's plug and play, just download them. And then FlowJo is going to provide you with a click and play graphical user interface that handles everything that you need to do to run it. It'll call the R package that came with these things, run it in the background, bring your results back into FlowJo. No R needed. If you'd like to grab another plugin that's not yet bundled into plug and play that has an R requirement, there are a step or two, such as copy and paste load the R library needed. Copy and paste the command that does that into R, hit enter and go, but no R needed beyond that. So our goal is to move away from you needing to know any R, and we've minimized it pretty well so far with these. There's a question from Amlan that says, is Cytonome part of the bundle? It doesn't show up in the drop-down menu. Another very good question. Yes, it is, in fact. Cytonome is the rare or more rare plugin that is a workspace level plugin. It does something to an entire workspace. And so I will show that one perhaps next, where we just hit the add workspace plugin tool and we'll get a drop down of all our workspace level plugins and can run it that way. It's going to actually take a folder full of data, produce new FCS files that have been normalized and so forth. So good question. Yes. I'm going to hit answer live to a few of these to clear out the queue. Let's see, from Shannon, how do you handle spectral data from the Aurora in FlowAI? So if it's say FlowAI question, yeah, so no real difference. What FlowAI is looking for is consistency over the time of acquisition. And so it's saying, did you see a spike in flow rate? Did you see a drop off in flow rate? Did you see a signal that suddenly became dramatically brighter or dimmer and so forth? And all of that, whether it was from the Aurora or any other cytometer, is going to be something that we can test for in FlowAI. We can check how many events are pinned to the maximum minimal axis. So no real special treatment needed. Okay, back over here into FlowAI. Okay, FR, flow rate. So we're dividing the data up into 1/10 of a second intervals and looking at all those 1/10 of a second for consistent amounts of cells, given some reasonable variability allowed, what the statistical significance you're looking for, an alpha value. Change points in FlowAI are just a moment where the signal jumps up or jumps down, fairly dramatically. How big a jump up or jump down is set by the change point penalty. I do suggest making this a little more generous. The bigger the number, the bigger the change has to be to get flagged. I think 500 is a better, more forgiving value to put in there. The maximum number of change points is how many big jumps will FlowAI look for. As my cursor is demonstrating while I use my hands to talk, because yeah, there's a little bit of Italian in me, you can just mouse over anything and it'll also tell you what the box does. And then I think the most important setting perhaps with this change point tunables is to click remove outliers. The default setup for change points is to, if FlowAI finds a change point, say either all the data before or after that change point must be an error because something changed during acquisition. It's totally possible that you might get a little surge and then the data on either sides of the change point they're both fine. They both reset to the same level. Checking the remove outliers button will allow you to just pull out the little bit of data in the surge and keep both sides of the change point. So I think that's a valuable thing, to not overdo data removal. So besides that, we've got the dynamic range, which you want to check one side, upper, lower, or both, for events that are effectively all dumped into the maximum bin that may have been way off scale. So we'd like to take those out, or dumped into the minimum bin that probably just junk, could be under scale anywhere. And I will say okay, and we will run that. And in 30 seconds or so, what FlowAI is going to do is give me a good events gate and a bad events gate. And then I can move on using the good events gate. Let's see. From Shannon, is a follow-up, are you running FlowAI on the raw files from the Aurora? And if so, how do you apply that to the unmixed files? So I would run that, on the unprocessed data. In that, folks will ask, can I run it on compensated data, et cetera, et cetera. You can. Generally, it's going to be okay. But if there's any issue with unmixing or compensation, you're then compounding what you're looking for in FlowAI. FlowAI might highlight data as being, just having some kind of mechanical issue, even though it was actually a compensation issue. So you'd set up a gate on the way FlowAI is going to work, and we'll see it right here, on a derived FlowAI parameter. Okay, oops, so my zoom controls are in the way of pulling this down to the middle of the screen. This FlowAI parameter, and if we make this a histogram, we'll see that it's working on the per cell level. For each cell that passes through, it says, okay, this cell was fine, this cell was not. And it gives it either a value, 2,000 or 6,000, I've arbitrarily picked. And it makes this range gate. So the gate's the same gate every time, which means this can be templatized, this can be applied to any set of data. It's not a gate that will impact whether you've compensated or not the data and so forth. So you can compensate the data and only work downstream on events that cleared the FlowAI good gate and go from there. Okay, so there's our bad events, good events. I could do a quick overlay if I like. Bad events, good events, and most relevant versus time. Cool, we see that there was a little maybe surge or so at the beginning that we gated out those events, and a handful of dots here and there throughout. So that's okay, and that's cool. That'll be about the result that you get from FlowClean as well, assuming you're completely trusting of algorithmic approaches. I will mention, I said I like FlowAI the best because, so here's my plug and play workspace and my demo folder, it produces a nice graphical output. So I'm going to double click on the plug and play folder that was created when I ran my first plugin. There's FlowAI. And go in here, there's a number of different graphics and CVs. It's all summed up in this one HTML page. And so if I double click on that, it takes me to the page that shows me graphically the 3 different tests. So there's my flow rate. Hey, there's the little surge. The green circles indicate the 1/10 of a second that was taken out of the data. There's my signal acquisition check. Yellow is the data that was kept, so it looks like the signal's pretty stable over time. One little circle at the end, one at the beginning where we saw a drop or a little spike. And then here is my dynamic range check, which I think is most easily understood at the table that says how many events were in the upper bin, how many events were in the lowest bin, how many events do we take out due to being on the bottom or top edge of the dynamic range. So that is the graphic that I really like that FlowAI produces that helps me understand why are some of those dots taken out? Why are some of those cells excluded? Now I know exactly. To conclude FlowAI, I do recommend deleting the plugin. Most of our plugins are set to rerun if you've changed something about your analysis, which might make sense for many of the plugins. Oh, there's an update, I should do something. FlowAI is run at the top level. It's just your first quality check. Nothing you do downstream is going to change the results of that. So we don't want it to rerun for any reason. So I just generally delete that once it's done. Okay. Let's see, we have a question here. How is that report identified to the input date, allowing its use on different runs? Good question. Let's just see. So each file will get its own, I've only run it on one file. Sorry, it's a demo analysis here. I would get a separate set of FlowAI outputs for each file. It'll tell me the name of the file, etc. It bundles it all up in a folder. Each file will be distinctly viewed. If you have the exact same file name, then I suppose it would look the same. And so I'll suggest in FlowJo, you can use basically any keyword as the file name. It's just done by using the heart up here, workspace. What should I use as the name? You could also use keyword combos. So if you have like, I don't know, let's say, well, A1, A2, A3, which are going to be pretty consistent, you could add in the date or something like that as one of the keywords that get used as part of our name and thus create a unique name that will allow you to separate and then sort. Good question. I had not actually thought of that one. All right. So FlowAI, I do see the chat has a little information in it. Yes. So Connor Fitzpatrick asks, is there, sorry, I don't know if I should say your name. Connor asks, is there a way to integrate FlowAI into a workspace template with a pre-existing gating hierarchy? So sure. What FlowAI produces are those good event, bad event gates. You can drag and drop that to a group. It will yell at me here if I do that, since these are all different data files and I haven't run FlowAI on any of them other than the first one. But those gates are very generic. It's just a range gate. So you can drop it into a template and hit save as a template. It'll just leave those gates there. And then when you run FlowAI on the new data, it'll create the FlowAI parameter right here that those gates are looking for. Gates are good, the events will be in it. You can drag and drop that FlowAI good events gate just like any other gate in FlowJo. So if you've got a pre-existing hierarchy, cool. Drop that gate at the top level, drag the rest of your hierarchy on top of the FlowAI gate, and you're all set. So that'll work. Let's see, Jinhang says, on the Cluster Explorer, put it in the plugin folder, but it did not show up in the flow. Restart Flow. Anyway, tech support question there. We will come to that. Cluster Explorer, one that Jinhang and I were looking at yesterday, which is one of my favorite tools for examining clusters. And I'll see if I can sort that out at some point. Okay, so that is FlowAI. Let's just take a look, I suppose, at index sort. If you've got some index sort data, you may want to visualize it. So I'm going to pick the index sort plugin. I can see, because I've put the name of the cytometers here, I'll just run it on one of these. I picked area. Let's do area. You can also ask for highlighting of particular parameters. Let's just grab maybe like CD71, CD57, something like that. Say OK, so that we can pick some highlight parameters. So the gist of this is that these are index sort files. They already have some keyword-based information that tells me something about them. So there we go. We got some results popping up. Let's stretch that out a little bit. To begin with, the layout includes just the plate map showing me, okay, this was index sort data. So yeah, I've got one cell per well. I picked two parameters there, CD71, CD57. It's giving me a little heat map of which well expressed. We use MFI here, but it really is, FI, since there's one cell per well, the fluorescent intensity of the chosen parameters. And then I get some dot plots down here of sorted events versus all. So in this case, the area just pops out a separate FCSL of just the sorted events. If we would have done it on the influx, which has sorted and non-sorted in one file, we would have seen some gray background. Anyway, sorted events and their plot on the parameters I've selected. So a bigger range of CD57s versus CD71 looks like they're relatively negative for that, and a spread of expression for 57. So you get a pretty good grasp of what has happened on your plate. Additionally, we've added a few parameters to these, such as index column and row. So here we've got how many cells are in each one of these. You could heat map this, you could gate on a particular well, etc. There you go. And then there's the extensive hierarchy that's just put into FlowJo, where it's listed by row and then well, and you can expand or collapse any of that. So index sort. And sorry, I'm speaking like we're short on time. Having covered the most exciting part of this thing at 8 minutes, we've got plenty of time here. So yell at me if I continue to speak at East Coaster pace. Sorry for all West Coasters here. Sorry also for the subtle dig on West Coasters. Okay, let's talk a little Flowsom. Flowsom's a clustering algorithm. Maybe we'll grab a handful of cells here. Good enough. So you can run this on a downstream population is all I mean to say by that. Pick out the guy we want, say Flowsom. It is going to ask me which parameters I'm interested in. Frequently, that's going to be all of them, or it is absolutely worth excluding any parameter that has no discriminatory power. So in this case, had I done a better job with my cleanup and maybe did a live dead gate, I might exclude the live dead parameter from this list, because presumably everything that I have kept is negative, it's live. And so if you feed a clustering algorithm, or for that matter, a dimensionality reduction algorithm, a parameter that's the same for every one of the events, what that's telling the algorithm is to make all these events a little bit closer, a little bit more tightly packed, because they are the same, at least by one measure. And so if you've gated them for a certain parameter, live in this example, just leave it out, and you'll actually probably get a nicer clustering result. So again, if I'd done a better job rather than just putting on a generic lymphocyte gate, we'd be doing well. Flowsom is one of our clustering algorithms. There's a number of other choices on the exchange. This is a particularly popular one for a couple of reasons. One, it's fast. You can run Flowsom in 30 seconds or so on relatively big data. 2, it produces very nice graphics. I like the minimal spanning tree that it puts out, and then it also, just like FlowAI, produces a folder full of graphical outputs of a variety of types that we can look through a little bit once we run this. And number 3, it's forward extensible. I'll point out there is an apply on map option here, which is empty at the moment. I haven't run it yet on anything else in this workspace, but if you run it on one file, we remember the map that it creates. How many clusters were there? What was the phenotype of each cluster? And then if you want to bring in more data and apply Flowsom to that new data, you can say, please run it on this map. And that way you'll get directly comparable clusters. Cluster 1 will be the same phenotype as cluster 1 if applied to the other data set. Okay, so Flowsom is 2 stages. The first stage is a self-organizing map. We start with a grid at the start of the process, and we start showing that grid cells. And whichever node of that grid is most like the cell we show it, we move that node to be a little closer to where that cell would have plotted in this imaginary plot I have drawn in my mind. Do that for, what do we got here? A few 100,000 cells for 260-some thousand cells, and your data takes on the shape, your grid takes on the shape of your data. Then with those, if we use the default 10 by 10 grid, so 100 nodes, those 100 nodes will tend to group where there were more cells, and they'll have spaces between where there were fewer cells. And then we'll divide the data, we'll cluster those nodes and say, here's your final number of clusters. So whatever we type in here as our number of meta clusters is how many we will result in the end. Okay, so let's say, okay, this is going to run for 30 seconds or so. We can look in, sorry, moving around some Zoom stuff, some Zoom windows, at our plug and play demo folder. And we'll see that, so we've created, by the way, there were all the graphics that show up for index sort, you also get a PNG of them. And so you also get some CSV information, so there's derivatives produced by index sort as well. We can open up the Flowsom file folder and notice that it is beginning to produce some outputs in here. As it heads towards completion, we'll see it'll begin to put out again some CSV files. It'll show MFIs of certain, of all the clusters. I showed the certain ones of all the clusters. And then it'll also start to produce some graphical outputs as well that we can look at. So here we go. That is well on the way. And pretty soon we'll see populations pop up in FlowJo. Time for a tea break. Good stuff. I was going to give it the boom. It's still thinking. Almost done. All right. Also, I will point out one of the tools in here, one of the heat mapping tools. Probably, if we have to talk about the downsides of Flowsom, is that it doesn't automatically figure out the best number of clusters. So I just left it for now as the default 8. I will mention, I think because of the speed of it, it's easy enough to rerun. I think a best guess based on how many parameters you fed it is fine. And then we can glance at some of these heat maps to take a better look at that. Okay, so there are my Flowsom produced clusters. I could go to the layout editor if I want here, hit the plus. I could, if I want, drag and drop an overlay of these clusters on, represent it with whatever parameters I thought were most useful. Probably a nice time to add some a t-SNE plot or something to this to see all the clusters holistically, or hit the plus and drag in my Flowsom icon and get the minimal spanning tree. Okay, so there is our legend. So each one of the circles is a pie chart. A little small at the moment. We can zoom in. Still a little small. I should probably go back into the preferences and make that bigger. But each of those is a pie chart that says, I also fed it a lot of parameters, which wedge is associated with which parameter. Each of the circles is one of the 100 nodes. And then the color, so which is purple on this top bit, is our cluster. And so you can see that is cluster 6 in this case. And you can see we've divided up the data basically into groups of tightly packed nodes, which indicate common phenotype. And the distance of the line between them is how similar or dissimilar any two nodes are, and then divide it up where you have a branch. So there's like the light blue one, the green one off of this pink backbone, the green one, and so forth, again with the color indicated here. So that's okay. Also then helpful are some of the output graphics that come up over here in your Flowsom folder, again, also tied to the name of the file. And the important thing, I think, to suss out what these are, first check out, so CSV versus PDF versus PNG, so two different types of graphical outputs and then numerical outputs. If it says POP, that is the population. If it says CL in front of it, that is the cluster. So the cluster is like the 100 nodes. The population is the 8 populations I asked for. So POP heat map will give us the heat map of those 8 populations and what they're each expressing. So we can go through and say, okay, great. So there's population 1 and 2, orange versus blue for whatever APCH7 there at the start. And move, oh, sorry, CD3 was probably the more relevant bit. So here's my CD3 positives. I gated some lymphocytes. Here's the one big negative population where we tossed all our negative for everything's in, and we can see which markers are most closely aligned. If we would go and use the cluster version of that heat map, and it's going to show us the same thing, but for the 100 nodes. And so for the 100 nodes, generally a fairly unusable plot, other than to say, hey, was 8 a relatively good estimate of how many clusters there are? You can look through and just see if there are large groups and use the dendrograms for guidance, large group of similarities. Like, okay, so here's a whole bunch of cells that look pretty similar for everything. And then there's a shift here where we see differences expression in granzyme B and perforin. So maybe that should be like 1, 2, 3, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I don't know, this all looks relatively similar down here, big sets of common expression, some variance across the board, mostly in TNF and interferon gamma, so you can expect that. Maybe I should have put in more like 20 as opposed to the 8 that I put in. I've probably underclustered this. So we could run it again if we want, using more like 20. Close all tabs. Okay, so in addition to that, there's some, just labels that you can check out. So if we end up with, a bunch of clusters and the colors start getting hard to differentiate, was that light green or even lighter green, you could just get the cluster number view. Oops, I have another meeting starting right now. I thought I'd turned everything off. You're not working if you're not at least double booked, at least. So sorry about that. Okay, anyway. Bunch of different kind of outputs you can get about your clustering that you can move forward through there. Cluster Explorer, also a great plugin that you can use to check those out. So I think the last two, let's talk about violin and cytonorm. A violin plot can be nice. Let's see, if we want to visualize any of these clusters, or violin and box, there's a whole bunch of different options. So the violin and box is just an RShine application. Don't have to type the R. That's just going to open up a browser and give you a lot of interactivity on how you can examine your data. So let's pick a few plots that a few parameters that we want to check out. Maybe look at a little CD27, TNF, pick a few of these others, good enough for now. And then if you want, at the bottom, you could tie in these graphics to a categorical parameter such as your Flowsom clusters. So let's hit interactive there. This will start up in a couple of seconds. Give me a chance to go look at Q&A. How do you know what number to put in the cluster parameters, the Flowsom bit? So for Lauren, for that one, if I have some idea about the data, I might add that. If I don't, knowing the number of parameters and assuming that there could be positive expression and negative expression for each gives me a rough guidepost. And in the worst case, make a guess and then check out one of those larger heat maps at the end to see if it seems like the guess was reasonable and rerun it if not. It's only about 30 seconds to make a Flowsom run. Not too terrible if you run it, go, ooh, not good enough, let me run it again. And how do you put the minimal spanning tree in the layout editor? That was just dragging and dropping of the Flowsom node. So grab that Flowsom node, drag it in here, and you get the MST. And it was also probably worth mentioning, advanced contains your settings for the graphics. So when I went in and said, like, maybe I wanted to use a different color or, plot these things a little bit differently, set a size, that's where you can get to some of that. Okay, so back to violin and box. I've got a variety of controls here. Anytime I change something, if I hit refresh, it'll do it for me. First thing you see is just what data has been brought in. So there's the parameters I selected. Here is all my different Flowsom populations, since I put in that as my categorical. You can choose a variety of different types of plots. Personally, my favorite are the rain cloud plots, which include violin, box plots, etc. You can click what you want. I'm gonna do some violins. I like to flip them and use the dark theme by default. It's just my preferences. I hit refresh. It'll think and let you know it's thinking with this spinning flower thing that reminds me of some of the old FlowJo flower power t-shirts we used to give out and such. Showing my age there. It's something like 30 seconds to generate the first plot as it makes whatever calculations need done. And then after that, if I want to change a color palette or etc., it's just a second or two for any updates to that. So the first one will definitely be the one that is the time investment to get a graphic out. And we'll see that in a moment. Okay, so chance to again catch up on Q&A. I think there's one more. How can you add text, e.g. legend, for different colors of clusters produced by Flowsom? So you get that by default, Madonna. Let us step back briefly to the layout here, where this is your cluster number, 0, 1 to 0 through 7, because computers always start with 0, and I put in 8 clusters. And those colors are the colors in the Flowsom plot. The colors of the pie wedges, which are again too small to see here at the moment because I picked so many, are defined right here. So like the lightest blue is the live dead, a little darker blue is CD4. Okay, stepping back to our Violinbox. Okay, so there is the particular color palette I picked, accent. There is the 5 markers I selected. Here are all the Flowsom populations. I tend to say I choose that flip violins option in that puts the text, reading horizontally, which is just my personal preference. I like it better than the vertical text, which just gets compressed and hard to read. And so now we're looking at the differences between clusters and saying things like, population 7. Oh, that had way more CD154, or way more CD154 positive cells than anything else, and also no negatives. Okay, so that's maybe a differentiating factor on why that one's a separate cluster. And we can look at TNF and see that cluster 7 and cluster 2 are the ones that have the TNF, and so on. Choose any option here, different colors, rotated, overlay, et cetera, I'm sort of a pure OR fan that we could then hit refresh, and then you'll just get whatever you've changed, different type of plot, different color scheme, et cetera, update it in your Violinbox plots. All right, and at the bottom, so we can also close up that download. We've got that done. You have options at the bottom for nearly everything. All right, and you can open and close that to give yourself a little bit more screen time to work with. Okay, so that's Violinbox. Interactive, lots of different plots that can come out of that. And so the last one I think we want to look at is running CytoNorm. So again, plugins. And you'll notice that amongst the choices of plugins, there's this Add Workspace plugin. So any plugin that wants to do something more holistic, doesn't want to work on a single node, is generally accessed here. And so at the moment, since I'm using Plug and Play, I've only got that one workspace plugin in there, CytoNorm. Say OK. It's going to ask me to point at a folder full of data I would like to run CytoNorm on. And hey, look at that. I have a CytoNorm data folder on the desktop. I'll pick that. Grab some files, say open, and then we're into CytoNorm. So CytoNorm is a normalization tool. It assumes that you've got a comparable control for each one of multiple, say, time points that are, that are going to be considered equal. So we could pick, year 01 as this is just the CytoNorm demo data set as the controls. And then I'm going to associate which control goes with which file. And so what CytoNorm is going to do is it's going to assume that if we run Flowsom in the background for a given number of clusters, we'll have a bunch of populations that pop out. We're going to do that commonly for all of these files. we're going to say, so we should have the same distribution for all of the controls. And so we'll use a linear spline to stretch or skew the axis as need be to make sure that the controls all have the same distribution, then apply that same scaling to the non-controls so that we have directly comparable data. It's going to create new FCS files that have had this scaling done. If you want the controls added in, check the controls box. Say, okay, it'll give you this graphic, it'll think for a while. And then in the folder that had the original data, you'll see an extra data set pop up that have been normalized using CyberNorm. Okay, so there it goes. It's starting to work. Starting to put some new files in there, which we can just drag and drop into FlowJo and proceed once that completes. Okay, so as that thinks, let me scroll through the Q&A. All right, I think I got those. Let me look at chat, has nothing more. We are caught up. Okay, that's about what I have to show you today. With, again, the main thrust of this having been achieved, whatever, half an hour ago, that this is now much easier to use. So I think you can tell how excited I am that we've got this new tool available, because I think some of these plugins are really powerful, and they're just great ways for us to connect people with really great science that's been done by a number of different people. So fingers crossed this makes all plugin use, at least these what, 3, 4, 5, 6 plugins much easier right away, and is the future path for ease of plugin use. Any other questions? Let's see, one thing has popped up in the chat. Will this pop up on webinars later? I don't know if it will pop up today, but this will go to the recorded webinars as soon as it processes. So it could be tomorrow, but very soon this webinar will end up with the rest of the recorded webinars. You're welcome. Okay, do I need to put the plugin into the plugin folder in FlowJo? You don't have to. We have a plugin folder, feel free to use it, but we are going to just use whatever you point to in the preferences here. So if you've picked FlowJo plugins, cool, that'll work. If you've picked pick me, because you made that folder somewhere on your desktop, it'll also work. All right, further questions? All right, if not, I thank you so much for joining me. Very excited to have shown this to you. I really appreciate you joining. Write us with questions. Have a great day. Ooh, thank you from Brazil. Well, thank you for joining from Brazil. I appreciate it. And it's been too long since I've been there, but I love going to Brazil. I've been there a few times in the past. Travel will happen again someday soon. Hey, take care all. Have a great one.